I'll be doing Northwestern. I'm not taking anything away from what their head coach, David Braun, did in his first season at Northwestern. That was an amazing coaching job by him. But before I can consider him to be one of the better college football head coaches, I've got to see more out of him because as horrible of a program as Northwestern has been forever. They have had seasons every once in a while where they'll win 8 or 9 or even 10 games, and then the next year they're back to being at the bottom or near the bottom of the Big Ten. Good news is Northwestern ranks second in the conference in returning production. They return 76% of their overall production, and they return the most defensive production of all teams in the country at 88%. But some bad news is recruiting in this coach's first year. It was still awful. Northwestern had the 80th ranked recruiting class. And I'm just going to go and tell you, I think that they are going to struggle this year. Uh, so I'm going to talk some about the roster, and then I'll go through the schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. So on the offensive side, Northwestern was horrible here last year. They only averaged at 21.6 points per game. At quarterback, it's kind of a mess. They don't return their starting quarterback, and they've got several different quarterbacks that are competing for the starting quarterback job, but they haven't picked a starter yet that I know of, and none of them are good quarterbacks. But quarterback was not a strength at all for Northwestern last year. They only averaged 202 passing yards per game last season, which was pretty bad. And At wide receiver, they do have a couple of pretty good wide receivers coming back. They've got Bryce Kurtz, who was their top receiver last season. He had 701 on 49 catches and 5 touchdowns, averaging 14.3 a catch. And against Minnesota last season, he had 10 catches for 215 and 2 touchdowns. And they've got AJ Henning, who had 418 on 45 catches and 4 touchdowns, averaging 9.3 a catch last season. These aren't elite wide receivers like Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors or Roma Dunze, but these are receivers that will have a chance to play in the NFL someday. And then at running back, they're not very good overall here. Cam Porter, the starting running back, returns, and he's a decent running back. He had last season 651 and 4 touchdowns on 166 carries and averaged 3.9 yards a carry. But there's nothing really about Cam Porter that it makes him any better than the average running back. There are really like 100 running backs similar to him out there in college football. And then another running back to help him out is questionable. And nowadays in college football, you really need two decent running backs on your team. And then on the offensive line, they do have three starters coming back, but they've got to play much better here than they did last year. And they do lose their best offensive lineman, Josh Preby, a guard who transferred out to Michigan. But last season, their offensive line allowed 51 sacks and only averaged 102 rushing yards per game last season, and that was 119th in the country. And they only averaged 2.9 yards per run last season because of how bad the line was. And on the defensive side, they were solid here last year. their defense averaged allowing 22.3 points per game, and they weren't very good against the run. They gave up 157.8 rushing yards a game, which ranked 81st. And then their secondary, though, was very good. That was how they got to the 8-win season. Uh, they ranked 15th at stopping the pass, only giving up 182.9 yards passing a game last season. So on the defensive line, good news is everybody is back from last season. But the bad news is their defensive line wasn't good last season. But it is nice to have all of that experience coming back. So they've got Aiden Hubbard, who was their sack leader last season, coming back. He had 6 sacks and 27 tackles and 8 total pressures and a pass breakup last season. And they've got their defensive lineman who had the most tackles coming back, Richie Haggerty, who had 36 tackles and 2.5 sacks and a fumble recovery and a pass breakup and 4 total pressures last season. And then at linebacker, they lose their best player from their defense last season, Gallinger. He was a really good player for them. That's a big loss. But they do have Xander Mueller coming back, who is one of the Big Ten's best linebackers. He had last season 110 tackles and 5 sacks and 2 pass breakups and 3 interceptions. And then in the secondary, they've got 3 starters coming back. So safety Devin Turner returns, who had last season 79 tackles and 5 pass breakups and an interception. He's a really good player, and so does safety Coco Azima, who has in 24 games these past 3 seasons combined 139 tackles and 5 pass breakups and a sack and an interception and 2 forced fumbles and a fumble recovery. And then at cornerback, one of the starting corners returns, who's a pretty good player, Theron Johnson, who had last season 37 tackles and 5 pass breakups and an interception. And then on special teams, both specialists, the kicker and punter, return, but the punter struggled last season. Now moving on to the predictions. They start the year against the Miami, Ohio. This isn't a sure win for Northwestern. I actually think that this could be a close game. I'd be surprised if it was a blowout, but I think Northwestern's good enough to win it. So then they play Duke at home. Duke isn't going to be very good. Now, I think these two teams are pretty similar. Duke actually probably has more talent than Northwestern, but Northwestern has a lot more experience, and they seem to be a better coach team. You know, Duke is losing a really good coach. So I think home field advantage for Northwestern gets them a really close win. Then they play Eastern Illinois. Now this will be a blowout win, I think, for Northwestern. They shouldn't have any chance of losing this game. And then they play on the road at Washington. So the two teams are pretty similar, I think. Washington's quarterback Will Rogers, though, is a very experienced, and Northwestern doesn't have a real experienced or a very good quarterback. Now, I'm not high on Will Rogers. I don't think he's that good, but uh, him being really experienced is better than if he was not very good and inexperienced. And Washington, I think, has a better running back unit. Now, I think Northwestern's offensive line isn't as bad as Washington's is going to be. Washington, I think, is really going to struggle on the offensive line this year. And then the linebackers for Washington, I think it could be a problem for Northwestern's offense, even though Washington's defensive line I don't think is very good. And Washington doesn't have a good safety unit like Northwestern does, but they've got a pretty good cornerback unit. So I think Washington is still a little bit better, and playing at home, I'm going to go with them to get a close win. But this is one that Northwestern could win. So then they get a week off and play at home against Indiana, a team that I'm pretty high on now. They're getting a much better coach than they've had in a really long time, and he brings in a lot of his players from his old team that are very good players. And even at home, I think that Indiana gets this win. I think they're the better team. But it'll probably be a pretty close one. And Northwestern is not a tough place to play. They have like the worst home field advantage in the country. Then on the road at Maryland, a team that is going to be pretty bad this year. But comparing rosters, they're actually pretty similar. And I think that Maryland's defense is going to be good enough to keep Northwestern from scoring a lot in this game. Northwestern will probably score in the 20s, but I think that playing at home for Maryland will make it the difference, and they get this win and a really close game. But another one that Northwestern could get. Uh, and then they play Wisconsin at home. Wisconsin's new quarterback, Tyler Van Dyke, is very experienced, and even though he's not looked very good at times, he's looked really good at times, and I think he'll be solid for them and better than what Northwestern is going to have at the quarterback position. And Wisconsin's got a much better offensive line and running back unit, and they've got a few good receivers too, including Will Pauling, who's one of the Big Ten's best receivers. Now, Wisconsin's defensive line, I think, is worse than Northwestern's defensive line, but the linebackers for Wisconsin and the secondary for Wisconsin, I think, are better than Northwestern's, and I think Wisconsin is just a little too good, and they win this game. But this one, I think, probably will end up being pretty close. And then on the road at Iowa, this is going to be a really low scoring game. I saw the score for this one last year. It was 10-7, and it'll probably be a similar score this year. I think Iowa's defense being so good is going to shut down Northwestern's offense to where they can't score hardly anything, and they can't hardly even move the ball to use up clock. And of course, Iowa won't score much. Northwestern's defense will keep them from scoring hardly anything either. But I think the defense for Iowa makes the difference, and they win a really close one. Uh, and home field advantage will help. Iowa isn't an easy place to play. Then on the road at Purdue, so Northwestern last season was a clearly much better coach team than Purdue was. But when you compare talent between the two teams, there's really not much of a difference. Purdue actually may even have a little more talent than Northwestern does. Now, Northwestern's got much more experience, but I actually think that home field advantage for Purdue makes the difference, and Northwestern also loses this one uh, in a really close one. But this is one that I think they probably will be picked to win. So this pick has a good chance of being wrong. And then they play Ohio State at home after getting a week off. No chance in this game. This will be a huge blowout. Northwestern's defense is not going to be good enough to slow down Ohio State's explosive offense, I don't think. And Ohio State's defense being so good is going to shut them down. Uh, so then on the road at Michigan, this will be another loss. Now, Michigan, I don't think will score a whole lot in this game because their offense is not going to be very good and it's not very explosive. But their defense is going to be so good again, and I think they'll dominate Northwestern at the line of scrimmage. and Northwestern won't score hardly anything, if anything, in this game. And Michigan, I do think will be able to get in the 20s in this game and probably win like 24-7. Uh, then they end the season in what's, I guess, a rivalry game against Illinois at home. So I think this will be a really close game. The two teams are pretty similar. Illinois' quarterback, Luke Altmaier, is more experienced, but he's not any good. And Northwestern, I think, has an advantage at running back, but Illinois probably does have a little bit of an advantage at wide receiver. And the offensive line is not great for either team. And the defensive line, though, I think is an advantage for Northwestern in this game. But Illinois, I think, has an advantage at linebacker and cornerback, but Northwestern, I think, has an advantage at safety. With these two teams being pretty even, I'm just going to go with Northwestern because they have the home field advantage. But this is a very losable game for Northwestern. So my final prediction for Northwestern is 4-8 overall and 1-8 in the conference. Now, I do think that they have a good chance to go to a bowl game. I think their ceiling is what they were last year, 7-5, because they're obviously not beating Ohio State or Michigan, and they're for sure at least going to lose several of those other games. But there are a lot of 50-50 games on here, so I think Northwestern could even finish as bad as 2-10. So there's a big difference between their ceiling and their floor. But that will be it with this video, and thanks for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll be back soon.